As an MP, I think the 2017 to 2019 Parliament was, it was terrible. You couldn't get anything done. It was deeply frustrating. It sucked all the oxygen out of everything else. Everything was seen through the prism of Brexit. And the fact that it was a hung Parliament and nobody could get anything done was just, I think, deeply frustrating.
Charles George Eustice, welcome to your exit interview, a chance for us both to learn what you could have done better. Now, as you know, you've been with us as an MP since 2010. You've recently said you're going to leave us at the next election. So thank you for coming to your exit interview to give us a chance to understand the reasons for your departure and learn about your experience while you've been with us. So I suppose the first question is, why are you leaving?
Well, I've loved my time in politics and I've enjoyed, not every moment of it, but most of it. It's been varied. I've had lots of different elements to my political career, but by the time of the next election, I will have done 25 years in total. The best part of 10 years as an advisor and campaigner on the No campaign and working for David Cameron and Michael Howard, and then 15 years as an MP, 9 years as a government minister, all in the same department. And I'll be 53, and I think I've got a chance to do something else in life, have a change and do something different.
Unlike so many people in politics, you had a proper job before. You're a strawberry farmer. What does it take to grow, what's the secret to growing good strawberries?
Well, growing strawberries is actually quite a nightmare to get right. Logistically, It's a huge problem. We used to employ about 300 people from about 15 different nationalities in those days. Even then, there was migrant labour. The locals used to call it the United Nations on our farm. And it's just a very difficult logistical thing to get strawberries from a field into a punnet, refrigerated properly on a lorry, and then into a supermarket shelf without anything going wrong. And the weather is a big factor. It can affect demand. Orders collapse just when you need them to go up. Sometimes you don't have enough labour when you need it. So it's a very tricky thing to manage, and probably quite a good grounding for my time in politics.
So let's talk about your time in politics then. We'll go through some of your various bosses in politics. Your first boss in politics was probably someone called Michael Holmes, who was apparently the leader of UKIP when you stood for the party in the 1999 European elections. You lost that one. Do you ever think your political life might have been different if you'd won? Presumably you were disappointed then, but you look back now and think it might be the best thing that ever happened.
I never expected to become an MEP the moment I think I was at the bottom of the list.
Yeah.
And I can remember I didn't stay in UKIP long. I was in there long enough really to work out that it probably wasn't for me, and I left and joined the Conservatives soon after. And the reason for that is I can remember the selection for that one, and I gave quite a pitch to say that we believed in friendship with our European neighbours, and we wanted friendship with the Danes and helped to support them on their Euroscepticism as well. And I gave quite a pro-European pitch for someone who actually felt we should also leave the EU. But my point was that the nation states of Europe weren't the same as the European Union. That was my underlying message. Everybody else got up and said, this is the greatest threat to our country since the Luftwaffe or Napoleon and so on and so forth. They went to the top of the list and I ended up at the bottom of the list.
You weren't scared enough about the threat posed by you?
I think I tried to probably have too much of a clever argument about the difference between the nation states of Europe and the European Union.
Back then, if someone had said in 1999 that at some point we were actually going to leave the European Union, would you have believed them? Was it a thing that everyone talked about the abstract without ever really thinking it was going to happen?
I would have thought it possible, but also unlikely, and that's because you would have needed at least one of the main political parties to have adopted that as a position.
Yeah.
And neither the Conservatives were then, quite squarely against joining the euro. But you remember, even in those days, it was, not for the foreseeable future was the sort of line. But nobody really serious was saying we should leave the EU. I mean, UKIP in 1999, that was the moment that they broke through into the public consciousness, and in that European election actually did very well, and they gradually built from that moment on, as did the issue.
You went on to run the No to the Euro campaign. You worked on the No to the AV campaign. You're obviously then part of the Brexit campaign. Have you ever been on a campaign which you haven't won?
Well, I don't think so, actually. It's a good point. Yes, I've had a pretty good track. I have been on some leadership campaigns that we didn't win. I won the first one when I was supporting David Cameron, but every other leadership campaign I've been on a losing side. But I did in that the first real proper campaign, where I really cut my teeth, to be honest, was at Business for Sterling and the No campaign. And that's when I worked with Nick Herbert, who was a very good campaigner, and also it's where Dominic Cummings and I first worked together. We were the same age. We were both at that point in our late 20s. We cut our teeth in the campaign against the euro.
So, what's your assessment of Dominic Cummings? Is he a genius or a menace?
I think he's got lots of talent, but he just cannot cope with organisation structures. Certainly. I always remember when he left Business for Sterling to go to work in those days for Ian Duncan Smith. We used to call him Colonel Kurtz was his nickname, and for anybody who is too young to remember it, that in the film Apocalypse Now, which was a cult 1970s film, Colonel Kurtz was a brilliant tactician, a colonel in the US Army who had all sorts of ideas for more creative tactics in Vietnam, all of which were ignored by the top brass. And he then eventually went mad, was driven insane by the bureaucracy and the structure, and ended up going down a river. And that was sort of summarised, really, Dominic Cummings. He had moments of brilliance, strategic brilliance. He would always shake things up, and you'd have, if you went on a mission with Dominic Cummings, there would always be quite a lot of casualties along the way, but he would tend to prevail and win in the end. But he can only really cope with things in short bursts, and organisation structures, boards, cabinet, those sorts of things drive him to distraction. Anything that is difficult to manage, and sadly, a big part of politics is managing a lot of other people's egos and trying to chart a way through that.
You then, after doing all that campaign, you became head of press for the Tories in opposition under Michael Howard when he asked the country, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" And they replied, "No."
I think actually, Michael Howard. He would have been a good Prime Minister in my view. I still genuinely think that. And he was a much more decent man than he's really given credit for. I remember once getting on, we were on a train station waiting to go to Newcastle somewhere to meet some, police commissioner up there, the Robocop person. I can't remember who his name was. And, Michael Howard was all the way on the train, distraught that we were rushed out by Rachel Whetstone, his advisor, rushed out of the cafe and never left a tip for the waiter in this cafe who had given us coffee. And he agonised about this all the way up. He was a very decent man. And after every party conference that's exhausting for those advisors, he used to send me a handwritten note thanking me for everything I'd done. And I think he would have been a good Prime Minister, but look, it wasn't to be, and we lost.
So then you threw your lot on with David Cameron, and you were his press secretary when he was leader in the opposition, which was when our paths first crossed. I think the first time I met you, you took me to David Cameron's house to do an interview. We did the interview in the car. The interview finished, and the car pulled up at some traffic lights, and you suggested I get out on a dual carriageway while you went off to get into a helicopter. Do you do that to all journalists? Abandon them on the side? Well,
we did quite often.
Dual carriageway.
we did quite often.
Well, it makes me feel slightly better.
I know you've used this in your stand-up act for several years, and I read it and I thought, I'm not sure I even recall doing that, but I have a vague recollection of that. We did used to do the pressure on the diary was so intense that they used to do meetings and calls and interviews in the car.
Yeah.
And so journey time in the car was always used. And so something would be shoehorned into it. It could be a phone call or it could be an interview with a journalist. And that was the slot you had. And of course, then we probably needed to get you out of the car because he probably had some other delicate conversations to do. I thought we dropped you actually at a tube station.
No, in fact,
I didn't know it was just in the middle of nowhere.
I ended up walking on the King's Road trying to find a bus stop. And I had to phone somebody in the office because it was pre having maps on my phone. I didn't know where I was. And I phoned somebody in the office who got out an A to Z. And I shouted out street names until we worked out where I was.
Well, let me apologise. I never realised that it caused such long-lasting impact on you for
to be honest, I've dined out on it. I've dined out on it for a long time. And what about David Cameron? Tell us about what it's like when you're crisscrossing the country with the leader of the opposition and the things that can go wrong, particularly when you're on the road.
David Cameron always used to say that, when I was joining him on the road, this is going to be a disaster today because George is with us, because I wasn't good on the road. Liz Sugg, who was his events manager, was far better than me at making sure everything worked to time. I remember once getting out of the car with him and taking him down the wrong road to a place where he was giving a speech, and all of the snappers and the media were at the wrong end of the other road, and so it was all missed. And it's a stressful time. I can remember the most memorable one I have is once he had to do a speech somewhere in the North Midlands. And in those days, we tried to avoid using helicopters like the plague because he had made such a big thing of his green credentials. But the only way he could vote in some legislation and get to this event was by helicopter. So we'd planned for him to just land somewhere discreetly, and for the local chairman to sort of pick him up, we assumed in a rover, and quietly take him to the event and not make a big deal about it. Little did we know that when a press officer arrived there to meet him, all of the world's media were there. Snappers, the Daily Mirror were licking their chops, because the local chairman thought he knew better and had actually alerted the world's media that there would be an arrival shot with David Cameron touching down in a helicopter. And worse than that, had also decided that he had a friend with a Bentley, and that it would look quite prime ministerial for David Cameron to step out of a helicopter and step into a Bentley. Yeah. And we had to scurry around, literally with 10 minutes to go, radio to the helicopter and literally divert them to a different field somewhere else in the locality to avoid, what would have been quite a spectacle.
And then you stepped back from that job because you then decided to stand as an MP yourself in the 2010 election, beating the Lib Dem Julia Goldsworthy in your home seat in Camborne and Redruth. You said that representing the area where your family have lived for more than 400 years, when one has such deep roots in a constituency, one feels a special responsibility for its long-term future. How would it feel stepping back from being the local MP in your hometown?
Well, quite difficult. And I said in my letter of resignation to the chairman, it's been a difficult decision for me. It's why I actually put it off to the final moment. But my local association, it's a battleground seat. It's always heavily contested, as you'll know. And they wanted to know, really. And I wasn't really up for going through the motions of being readopted, knowing that I might feel that I want to step back in 6 months' time. I didn't think that was a fair thing to do to them. So yes, it will be quite a wrench. And my family have got roots there, going back 400 years. I remember I always made a big play of this in that first election, that my family's been here for 400 years. And the Mebyon Kernow candidate, which is the sort of Cornish nationalists, one of them said to me, well, some of us were here before the Norman invasion. My family have been in the area a long time, but it's got Norman roots eventually at some point.
So you were born into a farming family. You then became Farming Minister, Environment Secretary. Have the Conservatives lost the support of farmers? The relationship doesn't seem that cosy at the moment.
I think it's been difficult and made worse by the body language that was coming from the government, particularly during the Liz Truss episode. It just caused a lot of anxiety in multiple areas. So green NGOs, who we had worked quite hard to get on board, were suddenly quite alarmed by what they were hearing. And farmers just felt that some of the trade deals that Liz Truss did really let down their interests. And I couldn't disagree with that. I fought very hard against some of those trade deals and fought to try and get better terms. But I think the trade deals in particular have sent quite a bad signal to sections of British agriculture. So the party's got to try and work, to rekindle that trust. And I think Rishi Sunak recognises that. He's in a rural seat. He is trying to build back those bridges with farmers. But there's another point, which is farmers, some of them, would like to just keep the old style subsidies for land ownership. And the old EU schemes of, basically paying hundreds of thousands of pounds to some of the wealthiest landowners in the country really doesn't make sense for the long term. And so we are trying to take them on a journey to say that we're going to pay you now for doing things, for the environment, for enhanced animal welfare, or to improve your profitability. But the idea of just paying you just for owning land, that really can't make sense in the future.
But isn't it sort of indicative of just how stuffed the Conservatives are if you've even lost farmers?
Well, it's a difficult time for us. And, there is a cycle to things, and we will at the next election be trying to win the 5th election in a row. I don't think that's ever been done, in history. But nothing's inevitable in politics either. And it is, I think, still quite possible that it could be more of a 1992 election come the day rather than a 97, because Rishi Sunak's doing all the right things. There's no shortcuts. You've just got to do the hard work of making the right judgments, get the economy back in the right sort of shape. And I think the difference between 97 and now is, whereas Tony Blair and his operation really looked like a government in waiting, I don't think that's the same for Keir Starmer. I don't think he's got a broad enough team around him yet, and I don't think they look like a government in waiting. And doubts could set in come the election.
Let me take you back through, George Eustice, as part of your exit interview. Let me take you through your bosses, your various managers, indeed, that you've had. And just get one word, just sum them up in a word for us. Let's start with David Cameron. How would you sum up David Cameron in a word?
He had good judgment.
Good judgment. Very good. That'll be interesting to see if you can say the same about all of these. Theresa May.
Timid.
Timid. What do you mean by timid?
I think she just was never able to take the difficult decisions really on Brexit. She was dealt a very difficult hand because we ended up with a hung parliament. But actually, rather than trying to reach out across party boundaries to try to build a consensus as to how to deliver Brexit, she just kept trying things that were obviously not going to get anywhere, and she would be buffeted about by events. My big frustration with her, and the reason I resigned in the end, was just the sheer extent to which she allowed her government to just be buffeted about by events.
Well, let's move on to the next person who created a lot of events. Boris Johnson, in a word.
Colourful. And Boris had strengths. He had weaknesses too. And in a funny kind of way, some of his strengths were at the same time his weaknesses. So there would be a boldness to Boris at times, and he would cut through the nonsense and get stuff done. And he'd have quite strong intuitive instincts about things and would drive things over the line in a way that some other prime ministers would always be talked out of action and would end up a bit like Theresa May, being so cautious and timid that nothing gets done. So that was his strength. But of course, his tendency to throw caution to the wind is also invariably what landed him in trouble. He was also incredibly loyal to people, so he would be very loyal to ministers who came under fire or attacked for things, and that's, I think, quite a good trait in a prime minister, but perhaps sometimes too loyal. And so sometimes he would stand by people when it became quite indefensible, and he would be tarnished by that.
David Cameron, good judgment. Theresa May, timid. Boris Johnson, colourful. Liz Truss, in a word? It's broadcastable?
Ideological. And my biggest frustration is always with Liz Truss. Most of our disagreements actually were on trade. She had a very set ideological view of the world, and you always had that sense, if you're trying to explain something technical and complicated to her, that she just wasn't even listening. She was just thinking about what she was going to say next. And what she was going to say next invariably started with the words, "I'm clear that," and then it would just be the standard ideological stance that she had. And I think that's quite a dangerous trait to have, because prime ministers have got to be able to grasp detail and deal with complex issues, and they've got to bring certain nuances to policies and judgments that they make, otherwise it all comes unstuck. And I think just her inability really to listen to others and to take on board that detail was her undoing.
Do you think the British public will forgive the Conservative Party for inflicting Liz Truss on the country?
I don't know. The jury is out on that. I think there will be some people for which the Liz Truss episode, that 45 days of chaos and the fact that the party could have done that, there were good cabinet ministers who supported her, to try to get a role in cabinet, and they should have known better really than to do that. But I think for a lot of the public, they'll think that's a point of no return, and that they will be done with the Conservatives at that, but not everyone. And so I think for a lot of others, yes, that will have damaged the reputation of the Conservatives, and people have put us, if you like, in the doghouse for now, and we're on parole and they're waiting to see. But I think it is still possible that, yes, when they see Rishi Sunak get things right and restore order, that they'll give him the benefit of the doubt and recognise that he's put things back together again.
Well, let's finish the set then. Rishi Sunak, in a word?
I think Rishi Sunak is quite close to David Cameron, and he's got good judgment. I mean, what I would say is, what I really loved about David Cameron, and I was his press secretary, is that even if he was put in a difficult interview and asked something really left field about some obscure local issue by a regional journalist,
Like me.
And you, and you knew that he hadn't been briefed on it, and it was some road scheme that he might not. He could always manage it and handle it and carry it off, even if he was asked something that took him by surprise.
Yeah.
And most of the other prime ministers we had after him, to be honest, if I saw them on television, I kind of used to fear for them. I worried what they would say if they were asked something that they hadn't been told the answer to by someone in advance, and that really can't work. There's a limit to what even a good press secretary can do. You've got to have somebody who's got a natural ability to do detail and to handle themselves well in a public environment. And I think Rishi Sunak has got that same sort of ability that I saw in David Cameron.
Of all of them, though, because of all the five, who was the best?
Now that's asking, because they've all got strengths, but I would say, well, they've all got different strengths and different weaknesses. I think for what I've said, you've got to, but I probably, because I invested so much of my time to try to get him there, would still be David Cameron, even though it was very difficult for me because I went against him on the Brexit vote, and I don't know. I think he found it quite difficult to reconcile, with that. The fact that so many old friends actually ended up on the opposite side to him. I don't think he really saw that coming.
Given that you backed it and he didn't, he said it would be a disaster, it would hit the economy, we'd spend years arguing about it, there was the upsides wouldn't be outweighed by the downsides. He was right, wasn't he? That Brexit has been a disaster.
I don't think so, because I think there's one good thing we've got, and I know there's been a lot of teething problems, that's for sure. Complicated as well by COVID in particular, but also Ukraine and all those other supply chain issues. But fundamentally, we are a self-governing country again, and I just don't think we were while we were in the EU. I was in a department where 80% of the laws came from Brussels, and most of my time was spent fretting about how we avoid infraction risks or penalties and fines from the European Union, and the department was just rubber stamping and implementing EU law. And it wasn't even possible for ministers to think creatively about what good policy would look like, and that's changed, and that's a positive.
But people will be thinking, well, being a self-governing country the size of our own laws hasn't helped with the cost of living crisis, it hasn't helped with the NHS, it hasn't helped with immigration. We took back control of our borders, and migration's at a record high. It's all very well and good how it's maybe it's the governing which is the bad thing, and that it's the Conservatives.
Well, I actually genuinely think we should move on from saying this is all about Brexit and start thinking, well, have we got this policy right or wrong? So if you look at trade policy, I've been critical of the Australia trade deal. I think we could have done much better, but at least we're free to have a trade policy, whereas in the EU it was unlawful for you to have your own trade policy. You weren't allowed to do that. You can argue about immigration policy. As it happens, I'm somebody who'd have a more liberal approach on immigration. I would allow so-called tier 3 unskilled labour to come in on 3-year visas. I think this skills-based immigration policy, it isn't actually working. We should have a needs-based policy where we allow in people we need in the sectors where there are shortages.
Like working on strawberry farms.
In the food industry, strawberry farms, care homes, the consequences of having labour shortages in these critical sectors is quite acute. And I would therefore have a needs-based approach to immigration rather than a skills-based approach. But that's at least we can have that argument.
You sound more like Keir Starmer than Rishi Sunak.
Well, I think at least we can have that argument, and we should have that debate, and that's what it should be like as a self-governing country. You won't get everything right, and when you make mistakes, you're able to put it right and correct it. Whereas in the EU, you never even had that right, and that's a positive. I mean, coming back to David Cameron, he was never an enthusiast for the EU. He and Oliver Letwin were sometimes referred to as secret outers in that they didn't, they weren't passionate about the European Union. I just think the difference between them and me is he felt, and probably was right about this, that it would just be quite a hassle trying to leave, and it would be difficult and complicated, and would take years to unpick. And he was proved right on that one.
And I always thought that was the strongest argument, the massive faff. The lost opportunity, the fact that all parliaments debated for years and years was the process of getting out rather than reforming schools or hospitals or the environment or whatever it might be. And we'll never get back those lost years, will we?
No, and they were tedious years. The Parliament of 2017 to 2019 in particular, a hung Parliament, the deal between us and the DUP to try to keep the show on the road, government losing votes left, right and centre all the time. the Parliament hijacking the order paper. It was an absolute nightmare to try to deal with that. And I really think Parliament failed to rise to the challenge. I actually resigned from Theresa May's government to make the case, you might remember, for EFTA and the EEA. So I went from being the UKIP man to saying, we need to find a settlement to this, and Parliament should be grown up about it. It was a clear decision to leave, but quite a close result. And if we came out of it and we were in something akin to the EEA or EFTA, which the UK invented back in the 1960s, I didn't think that would have been a bad outcome. And I argued the case for that. I thought I could unite Parliament behind this theory. But of course, I united both factions to say this is rubbish because we should either leave completely, cut ourselves off completely, or we need a second referendum. And you've got these two entrenched camps that failed to do what Parliament must always do, which is compromise to get a settlement.
What's been the best part of your job as your time as an MP?
Well, I think as an MP, rather than a minister, there's nothing more satisfying than when you manage to get an outcome for an individual constituent that's got problems. And so I've helped people whose house had partly fallen down mine shafts and drainage holes, and they couldn't get insurance, and we've intervened and managed to sort those problems out for them. I've had people who had real problems getting the right benefit support or the right housing, and we've helped get their lives back on track. And there are thousands of cases like that where we've just helped people in their everyday life, and it's really satisfying when you can do that. A lot of times you try and you're unable to get an outcome for people, but on a constituency level, just helping people with those problems in their lives is what makes it worth it. And then as a minister, really I've got three flagship bills or acts of Parliament now, in the Fisheries Act, the Agriculture Act and the Environment Act. I was closely involved in designing all three of those, and they put in place really the policy frameworks for everything DEFRA needs to do in the post-EU era. And that's quite something, I think, to look back on. It'll stand the test of time, whatever future governments do. The powers that they need are in those various acts, and I think they'll still be used probably in 20 or 30 years' time.
When you were Environment Secretary, were you responsible for plastic straws?
Yes, I was.
Could you not have written a law which meant that paper straws had to be thick enough to finish your drink?
I have thought the same myself, and sometimes the paper straws aren't good enough to pierce a carton in the old way.
I think that law needs revisiting.
I'm sure they will improve this. It was actually done. I was in the department at the time. It was done during the tenure of Michael Gove. It was something that we were pushing forward. But a lot of progress has been made on some of those new restrictions on plastics.
So that's your best part of the job. What's been the part of the job or the moment you enjoyed the least?
I think as an MP, the hardest...
just while you've been in politics.
Well, the hardest and most frustrating thing, I think, is when you can't get an outcome for people and you've got huge sympathy for their plight. And however you try, you realise you reach the end of the road and you have to break the news to them that you've done all you can, and I'm sorry, we can't help you any further. And that's a very difficult thing, and every MP has to have those sorts of conversations on a weekly or monthly basis with people. And then as an MP, I think the 2017 to 2019 Parliament was, it was terrible. You couldn't get anything done. It was deeply frustrating. It sucked all the oxygen out of everything else. Everything was seen through the prism of Brexit. And the fact that it was a hung Parliament and nobody could get anything done was just, I think, deeply frustrating. And a lot of people, kind of went off the rails. I mean, there are a lot of MPs who, went a little bit, I think, mad would be the wrong word, but close to it, through the difficulties of that time. And many of them chucked the towel in and quit politics in 2019.
Would you recommend it to a friend?
Yeah, I would, and I've absolutely no regrets about it. And I think I've been quite fortunate in that I've seen it from lots of different perspectives. I saw opposition. I was involved in a campaign group. I was press secretary to David Cameron when he was on his way to Downing Street, and that was an incredible thing to be part of. Very hard work, but an incredible thing to be part of. And I've been through politics and left several acts of Parliament to my name. So yes, it's very varied. You can't get bored. There's different issues. If you get bored of an issue, then you can champion a different one. You learn something new every week because people bring all sorts of obscure, difficult problems to you, and even now, new problems come my way on things that I haven't encountered before. So it's very varied, very rewarding when you get an outcome, and it's got lots of frustrations. But I think every job has its fair dose of frustrations. And in politics, the most difficult thing is you never understand until you get into it just how difficult it is to get anything done. You think when you're a candidate that when you're an MP you'll be able to get things done, and then when you're an MP you still can't get much done. You can do debates and you can push things and push amendments, but you hope that when you're a minister you'll get things done, and then you still actually really struggle to get things done. And it's only really when you become a Secretary of State that you can really start to drive stuff over the line. But even then, it's very frustrating. You have to have arguments with cabinet colleagues to get things done.
Who did you have the biggest argument with?
Liz Truss, without a shadow of doubt. But we regularly also had arguments with the Home Office in particular over immigration policy.
And who was there then? I'm trying to think who the...
It was mainly during Priti Patel's time. They had a very strong views about the skills-based immigration policy, and didn't particularly like the seasonal agricultural workers scheme. And every year, was a constant battle to get a consensus on that.
Final question then, George Eustice, in your exit interview. As you leave us, what will you do next?
I don't know. I'm taking a leap of faith, but I've always done that. I left David Cameron's office without really knowing what I was doing next, except apart from thinking I'd like to try for a seat. And I left the No campaign not knowing whether I'd get another job in politics, and I managed to work for Michael Howard. And this time, my aim really would be to try and work in agri-food or agri-tech. I've got 9 years experience in that sector through the government departments that I was in. I developed quite a lot of technical knowledge in those sectors over that time, and I'd quite like to stay involved in that industry. So that would be my aim. But for now, I've still got another year plus to do with this role, and obviously got plenty to be getting on with.
Well, George Eustice, Conservative MP, thanks very much for joining us for your exit interview.
Thank you.